In the previous video, we talked about how economics is a science. If economics is a science, how come every time they interview an economist on TV, they never agree, right? Every time you read an opinion page or an article where they've talked to economists, it's something completely different. All right, so a joke by economist says, what do you get when you put 5 economists in the same room? You get 6 opinions. Economists like to tell jokes, doesn't mean they're funny. So economists are famous for saying, on the one hand, this is what will happen. On the other hand, this is what will happen, right? So we said our economic models say, if this, then that. And the real world is a lot more complicated than just if one thing, then another, right? We have lots of things happening simultaneously. And so that's why you might get multiple opinions, even from the same economists. But the reason that you're getting different things from different economists is because economics is not just a science, okay? Economics also is made up of values. So economics in practice is a combination of the science that we just talked about, as well as of values. So our influences, our history, our priorities, our opinions, they impact our reasoning and they impact our actions. And so it's important when we do economics that we be able to differentiate between what is the science aspect, that is, we can test it using the scientific method, and what is more opinion, priorities based on how you were raised, what you value, and so on. Because when we get economic perspectives from people, it's a combination of the two, the science combined with those values. So it's important that we separate between the two, and we have different terms for those different aspects. So to differentiate between the science and the values, we call one positive economics and one normative economics. So positive economics are statements about fact. These are things that we can check, we can verify. They explain how the economy works. Okay, so if we do this, then this, right? That's that economic model that shows the relationship. And we could check, we could observe to see what's happening. It's not a statement about whether something is good or bad, but simply what will happen if something else happens. Whereas normative, on the other hand, is a value judgment or a statement of an opinion. Because it's opinion, because it's subjective, we can't really verify it or check it. Okay? It explains how we think the economy should work, what we think should be done, what are the priorities when it comes to the economy, as opposed to describing what's happening. It's a judgment statement about whether the economic outcomes are good or bad. And because we said the economy is very complicated, lots of things impact other things, we often have to create priorities, right? If the government decides to print more money, that can stimulate spending because it puts cash in people's pockets, but at the same time, it can drive up prices. So the positive statement here is that if the Bank of Canada prints more money, then households will spend more. We can check that. It's a statement of fact. We can test it. The normative statement is whether or not we think the Bank of Canada should print more cash. Should we have more money in circulation? What's the bigger priority? Fighting the price increase, the inflation, or getting people spending, right? So right now with COVID-19, there's this debate in terms of how much should the government spend to help stimulate the economy, pay people who can't work or aren't working, versus the debt that is accumulated when the government spends. So if we say that by having supplementary pay, people will be more likely to stay home and not work so that we don't spread the virus, or we could check that. We could see if that would happen if we gave people more money. Or we could say, well, if we give people more money, then they will go out and buy things, and that will help the economy grow. We could see that if that happens. Whether we should prioritize, helping people pay money so that they can stay home, or to get them spending, or whether we shouldn't put out any money at all so that we don't go into even more debt. Those are normative statements. They're based on opinions and judgments. And so we have to recognize, both when we hear other people's economic ideas, as well as when we develop our own, how much of it is positive economics, so we can check it, versus the normative economics. It's our opinion that's been sculpted by our history, our values, our perspectives. So let's take a look. All right, so here on the left, let's suppose that this is our economy, and here's how we've decided to budget our money. We're going to allocate 25% of our tax revenue to military spending. That's a positive statement. We could check if that's true. Did we allocate 25% to military spending? Year 2. For our economy here, you can see that we have allocated 60% to military spending. Again, positive statement. We can check and see if that's the case. How we get from year 1 to year 2, right? Someone had to decide that military spending was a priority. And here we have the normative statements, right? We should spend more on military spending. We should enter into this conflict. So the policy decisions and how we get from year 1 to year 2 are those normative statements in terms of what should we do? What do we value? Military here in this example, more important than other components. So let's relate this to the real world. And next to this video is a link to an article by CBC News. And it says, sure, we could spend 4% of GDP on the military with huge cuts or tax hikes. And the idea here is that US President Trump has been pushing for NATO members, and so we are a member of NATO, to commit more to military spending. And so what Trump would like to see is that each member of NATO provides more funding to the military than currently. And so we're talking about increasing. Many countries are in NATO currently spend only 1 or 2%. And to make that higher. Excuse me. So Trump wants it to be 4%. Okay, so currently we spend in Canada 1.23% of our federal budget on NATO. Okay, NATO itself, we signed an agreement that we aspired to 2%. Trump would like it to be 4%, which means that we would need to increase our military spending to $60 billion. We need to increase it $60 billion. So $60 billion more than we currently spend on NATO and military spending. So should we do that? Should we spend more on the military? Well, the should part is the normative part. It's an opinion. Do you value what NATO does? Are you willing to give up other things that the government spends money on? Currently, Canada spends 8% of its GDP on military. The US spends about 15%. And the big discussion over the last couple of years is how much should each country spend on NATO, on the North Atlantic Treaty that we are a member of.